It caught everyone off guard. Nobody cares, not the viewers, not the TV show, not even Joni. The public mayhem that started as a subtle strain behind Daystar's illuminating cameras has now escalated dramatically. The ministry world was rocked by Joyce Meyer's bombshell admission, which left Joni humiliated and caught off guard. Several million. Lingering secrets are being brought to light after years of whispering, and Daystar will change irrevocably. Standing under the intense studio lights, Lamb maintained that same unwavering smile for years. He appeared composed, polished, and unmoved. She exemplified grace and faith, seeming unfaltering to millions of viewers around the globe. However, little fissures had begun to appear beneath that flawless image. At first, they were low-key, things that only her closest friends and family could perceive. The Daystar, which had originally been a welcoming family-run ministry, was starting to feel more and more like a place of stress and anxiety due to factors such as long days, abrupt meeting tone, and rising tension around the building. Her strength, which had always been confidence, was now becoming her dominant trait. It was her desire for each choose to bypass her. She used to be in charge of every single project and broadcast, down to the nitty-gritty. Whispers circulated among those who had earlier praised her leadership about how difficult it was to satisfy her. If there was dissent, they were removed or transferred to another division without making a sound. A sense of oppression settled over Daystar. Those who used to joke and pray together before gatherings now whispered for fear of losing their position. The stress followed her everywhere, even to her home. Even her once proud son Jonathan started to withdraw from her. Their once inspiring talks devolved into bickering over who gets to decide where things are headed. He wasn't quite prepared to let go, but he did want to offer fresh ideas to make the ministry more open. She convinced herself that she was defending what God had created, but in reality, she was terrified of losing it. The faithful leader, with the flawless words and unwavering confidence, continued to be shown on television by the smiling woman outside. Feeling it slide inside, though, instead of motivation derived from purpose, it was terror. She was attempting to prevent everything from collapsing by holding on too tightly. However, it appeared to crack more quickly the more she gripped on. The shift was noticed by all around her. Rumor had it that had been preoccupied with advancing her own reputation at the expense of expanding God's kingdom. Some said she appeared exhausted, as if she had been carrying a heavy load for an extended period of time. The murmurs became into inquiries, and those inquiries started to circulate. It seemed like everyone could sense that something was off, regardless of her lack of control over the situation. In the wee hours of the morning, when everyone had gone to bed and the lights were low, she would sit in her office, bathed in the soft light of the monitors that played back her broadcasts. Every time she looked into the eyes, she would see the same self-assured expression and wonder when it had all begun to feel such as a performance. She had encouraged others to put their trust in God no matter what for a long time. The truth was staring her in the face now that she had to face her own. A crack was appearing in the crown she had fought so hard to maintain. Joyce Meyer did not speak for quite some time. She had known Lamb for quite some time. They had shared prayers, stages, behind-the-scenes laughter, and tears as they faced life's challenges. From the outside looking in, they were a formidable team, two independent women united in their Christian mission. Despite their camaraderie, Joyce sensed a shift. The woman whose humility and compassion she had once admired appeared to be transforming into someone else. Someone who is enamored with control, reputation, and authority. Joyce first pretended not to notice it. After losing her spouse and ministry partner Marcus, she convinced herself that every leader goes through tough times and that she simply needed time to heal. However, the indicators could no longer be disregarded. What was going on within Daystar was whispered to Joyce. Everything was tense and terrifying, and the employees were being quietly let go. She received a heartbreaking call from former workers who claimed they had lost track of Yodoro. With a heavy heart, Joyce listened, unsure of what to do. She was averse to engaging in idle chatter and to pass judgment. Therefore, she uttered a prayer. She prayed to God nightly for guidance in locating her companion. Joyce made multiple attempts to contact. At various hours of the night, she would contact, her voice low and solemn, inquiring as to her true condition. The words, "I think you're trying to carry too much. You don't have to control everything. Let God take the lead again," would utterly escape her lips as she shrugged them aside. She'd assure everyone that everything was fine, chuckle slightly, and say she'd slow down. But she never actually did. It was obvious to Joyce, who had stopped listening to her. On February 9th, Robert began his personal road to recovery. It seems like the woman who used to pray over every choice was now busy constructing her own empire. Months went by, and Joyce's worry turned into a subtle pain. Whenever she watched a rehearsed grin on television, she could sense the strain in her spirit. Such assured statements. There was a problem. Joyce understood what it was like to let pride lead her astray, to believe she was serving God when in fact she was only trying to shield herself from harm. Own representation. Having been through her fair share of self-correction and truth-humbling experiences, she could see that it making its way towards the same wall. One morning, when Joyce was praying, things finally snapped. While meditating on God's word in her Bible, she experienced emptiness, not wrath, but grief, in her heart. I needed to say something. To speak the truth, even when no one else would, without causing pain or embarrassment. It was going to cost Joyce, she knew it. Some people could not accept her, and she could lose their support and perhaps respect as a result. Get it. Still, she was aware that remaining silent was a deception in and of itself. After gathering herself, she dried her eyes and made up her mind to follow God's will. Neither cameras nor crowds were there when Joyce eventually spoke. The setting was a modest church, assembly encircled by devout followers who had faith in her. Her voice was steady and unruffled as she stood there clutching her Bible. "I have loved like a sister," she whispered gently. "However, when I witness a sacred object being used for personal gain, I am unable to remain silent." The room fell into a hushed stillness. Individuals drew near, uncertain if what they believed to be audible sounds were actually there, deceased said, her voice quivering with passion. Leadership, humility, and the ease with which even decent people can fall from grace were some of the topics she covered. They lose sight of reality when they achieve success. Creating our own empires is not something God asks of us. She spoke with conviction, saying, "He calls us to serve. And when the work becomes more about power than about people, something has gone wrong." Her comments resounded with power throughout the Christian world. The word got around fast. Internet users, members of her religion, and media outfits that value drama more than facts spread clips of her speech. The headlines screamed, "Joyce Meyer calls out Lamb." Some praised its bravery, others betrayed her. Joyce didn't want to be a distraction, so she returned to prayer and turned off her phone. She hadn't spoken to generate commotion. She had spoken because her silence had caused others too. Within hours, Daystar's followers and detractors were debating online. It had grown intolerable, but she couldn't turn a blind eye to the ripple effect it had. Retired colleagues started contacting her, praising her for speaking up when they felt they couldn't. "You said what we were all afraid to," read one note. "Thank you for bringing light into the dark and obviously knew about it." She didn't have to inquire what happened because she knew what had happened when a trembling voice called one of her producers first thing in the morning. Joyce muttered something and they informed her, but she froze. Christian media channels were abuzz within hours as she felt a mix of rage and anxiety as the moment she had dreaded arrived. She wondered who else would talk and who else had been watching. Joyce spent that week in profound contemplation as some pastors supported her, claiming that the enemy was using division as a weapon against the church. Others quietly conceded that Joyce had spoken what many had been saying for months. Reporters, pastors, friends, and detractors were all phoning her, but she refused to debate them, instead saying, "I spoke what God placed on my heart." That sufficed. The point wasn't to humiliate or destroy her. Rather, it was to show her and everyone else watching that no leader is immune to criticism, that faith must precede celebrity, service must before power, and humility must precede pride. Nevertheless, she felt the weight of it all as she slept. Joyce sat in her peaceful living room, reflecting on the past. The joy they once shared, the prayers they said, the simpler times when their ministries were smaller, but their hearts were lighter. It hurt tremendously to be the one to break the news, but she knew deep down that love can take the form of confrontation. It's not always about providing comfort, but rather about rescuing someone from the brink of ruin. Joyce preached again the day after the news broke, but this time she omitted Joelle's name. Instead, she stated, "No matter how much it pains you, you must obey God's voice when He calls you to speak." Although it may be painful, the truth ultimately leads to liberation. As the message played on her screen, Lamb sat motionless in her office for what seemed like an eternity. It was painful to hear, but she knew in her heart that it wasn't hateful. Rather, it was love, the type that speaks what others are afraid to. At that moment, she admitted something she had never dared before: the breaking of her heart. The point wasn't the end, but rather the beginning of something she could no longer turn a blind eye to. The storm didn't arrive as a raging torrent, but rather as a gentle whisper. Joyce Meyer's words had scarcely ceased to reverberate when they started to spread like wildfire. The news spread like wildfire across social media, news outlets, and church circles. Inside Daystar, people pretended everything was okay, but everyone could sense the shift. The atmosphere was thicker, the quiet more acute. The ministry that had previously thrived was transformed forever. Lived by faith and enthusiasm was now lived by anxiety and dread. People wore masks in the halls, shortened their prayers during meetings, and an underlying question of what happens now seemed to be in every conversation, complex and distressing. A large number of people had served under Lamb for many years, having faith in her mission and her desire to see the gospel preached. They recalled her early generosity, her habit of praying with them before broadcasts, and the way she enabled them to sense of belonging. However, everything had changed. What had once motivated them was now causing them anxiety. They had to tread carefully in every meeting. A few of her employees fervently defended her, claiming that Joyce Meyer had misread the situation, and that there were some who subtly conceded that Joyce could be correct. They had sensed the building terror within Daystar prior to the world becoming aware of it, and emails began to flood in from viewers all across the globe. Feelings of anger and sadness were expressed by others who said, "This isn't what Christians should be doing." Others wondered how Joyce could have betrayed her. Others expressed gratitude to Joyce for being forthright, noting that they, too, had felt something was amiss for quite some time. In the midst of it all, she watched as her carefully constructed persona began to crumble under the scrutiny of the internet commenters. At first, she attempted to disregard the criticism, going on camera as usual, her voice unrecognizable, serene, her grin unwavering. But there was an uncanny tightness in her face that the cameras picked up on. Her words of hope and endurance rang hollow even to her. People remarked, "She doesn't look the same." Someone wrote, "It seems like something is amiss." Behind the scenes, the strain was immense. The board wanted explanations regarding the accusations, the money, and everything else, and every broadcast felt heavier, as if she were preaching through fog. Her once flawless assurance had become brittle, the public's increasing disapproval. A few loyal board members argued that Joyce's statement was overly dramatic, while others advocated for more audits, openness, and responsibility. Behind closed doors, passionate debates erupted. The rooms that once resounded with worship songs. After years of unity, they were now divided along ideological lines. The ministry was facing internal strife as well as external criticism. Not only that, but his family was also affected. Daystar's children, who had grown up in his world, were entangled in the turmoil. Missed. Her son, Jonathan, was particularly conflicted. He loved his mom very much, but he couldn't turn a blind eye to the mounting disquiet around him. Members of the staff approached him privately, seeking an explanation, and wondering whether the ministry was still committed to God, or if it was merely attempting to safeguard. Donations slowed, and he found himself in a fight with her at home over her questions about his image. He wanted to help her realize that things needed to change, but she wasn't ready to listen, and every challenge felt like betrayal to her. She felt a rising panic as she watched the numbers every morning. The declining funds and ratings and the partner ministries quietly distanced themselves. citing the need for clarity before continuing. Longtime supporters paused their giving. She had spent her entire life building Daystar, and now it felt like it was all falling apart. The stress was starting to show, and she stopped sleeping well. At night, she would pace the home, read emails from frustrated viewers, or just stare at herself in silence. Bible, seeking solace she couldn't discover. Praying, but the words no longer flowed freely. It was as if she were speaking into thin air. The once confident preacher of faith now felt engulfed in uncertainty. Daystar, the ambient temperature rose. Chillier. Workers ceased decluttering their workstations and ceased joking during breaks. All discourse took on an air of caution. People began to depart stealthily, with some opting to resign and others just taking a leave. Volunteers who had earlier given so much joy and warmth to the ministry started to disappear, and those who remained felt trapped, loyal but confused about why they were fighting. And then there were the spectators. The millions who had looked up to them as an example of faith and strength now watched the news with doubt in their hearts. Some churches even ceased airing Daystar programs in an effort to avoid controversy. The once unshakable empire was now in shambles. She clung to the belief that this was all a test, that God was letting the storm test her strength, but she knew in her heart that this was all an act of denial and routine, driven by her pride. Sitting alone in her office one evening, long after everyone had gone home, she realized that this wasn't a test but a reckoning. The ministry had transformed into something she didn't recognize, and the more she struggled to keep it under control, the more it slipped away. As she noticed the photographs on the wall, photos of herself and Marcus laughing in happier times, when the purpose had been pure and simple, a tear rolled down her cheek. She mumbled a prayer, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the lights above her. Lord, what have I done? The storm had moved within her, into every breath, decision, and restless night. She had spent a great deal of time attempting to shield herself, her ministry, and her power from the storm. However, she had lost her serenity in the process. The consequences extended beyond matters of reputation and wealth. They touched on issues of faith, identity, and truth. She came to understand that storms do more than destroy. They also unveil. The secrets she had buried and the pieces she had attempted to put back together were now exposed. Daystar was broken, and the people she cared about were in pain. She realized finally that this wasn't about weathering the storm. It was about confronting it head-on and accepting that a shift was necessary before all hope was lost. The moment of change arrived not through flashbulbs or news reports, but in the stillness of an empty office after the last employee had left for the day. Lamb sat at her desk, the lights low, her Bible open before her, but her gaze wandered. The pages were her words, which she had taught for decades. Faith, humility, and surrender felt like faraway echoes as she stood here, surrounded by her own chaos. The empire she had inherited from her husband and had worked so hard to build was crumbling before her eyes. It was shaking, and no amount of control was helping. She had fought it off for months, but it seemed like a performance, a last-ditch effort to show that she was strong and in control, against the rumors, the criticism, the murmurs in the halls, and every meeting, broadcast, and prayer. But the burden of keeping everything together was tearing her apart from the inside out. When she finally managed to get some sleep, it was accompanied by nightmares about stages falling apart and studios going dark. As she walked through the Daystar building just before dawn, she noticed that the corridors were silent and the studios were dark. As she paused outside the main control room, the beating heart of the ministry, she stared at the blinking lights of the machines. It hit her all at once. She had spent countless nights there arranging broadcasts and making sure every detail was correct. It was no better at home, where her children had become distant and her friends wary. Conversations with her son Jonathan often ended in silence or tears. She had become as lifeless as the machinery she worked with. He begged her to take a break, trust others, and let go, but she refused. She felt like a failure if she did. She had led this ministry through tragedy before, when she buried Marcus and continued to broadcast a message of hope. Could get through this. However, this time was different. Instead of pain, which she could pray away, it was pride and terror. One night, after yet another stressful board meeting characterized by accusations and defensiveness, she went home in tears. As she pulled into the driveway, she silenced the radio and sat down, her vision distorted by the city lights outside the windshield. It was at that moment that she realized she was exhausted on a spiritual as well as a bodily level. Trembling, she said, "Oh my, I am at a loss as to what to do." Meanwhile, everyone else stood there and did nothing. It wasn't a strong leader's prayer. It was a weary woman's cries for help. The following day, she skipped work. As she sat at home in the little prayer room that Marcus had constructed years ago, she began to speak to God honestly for the first time in months, confessing her fears, stubbornness, and pride. She hadn't spent much time there recently. It had become more of a memory than a sanctuary. Surrounded by old photos, though, she felt more at ease. Tears flowed freely, but this time they weren't furious or frantic. Rather, they were cleansing. Something started to change over the following few days as she confessed that she had attempted to own a ministry that was never rightfully hers. Many mistook her choice to cancel meetings, which she justified by saying she needed time to pray and reflect for a public relations ploy. In reality, she was only trying to stay alive. She also had a meeting with her children. After a while, she stopped defending herself and started listening. Jonathan expressed his deep love for her while simultaneously lamenting the loss of her mother, who had a more carefree and joyful personality and would pray with her family instead of micromanaging them. Den remained silent. Then she broke down in tears and stated, "I agree with you. Attempting to defend an entity that was not rightfully mine caused me to lose sight of who I am." Returning to Daystar that weekend, not to lead, but to apologize, she assembled her core team, those who had been there from the beginning, and spoke to them with a quivering voice, telling them she had made mistakes, that she should have trusted God instead of fighting so hard to maintain control. The room fell silent. Some were startled, others sobbed. It felt like the walls were crumbling for the first time in years. Then she made a decision that would alter the course of events. Instead of stepping back in defeat, she was prepared to surrender. She made an announcement that she was delegating more responsibility to her leadership team while she sought God's will for her life and the ministry. The public statement she issued lacked polish and strategy. Her honesty about her troubles, pride, and need to return to faith rather than fame elicited a range of reactions from viewers, some of whom were suspicious and others who were brought to tears. It was real. Inside Daystar, though, a lovely thing started to happen. Staff members who had been terrified began to breathe again. Talks turned candid. The mood changed from dread to optimism. It wasn't ideal, but rebuilding it would take time for trust to be restored. But after a long period of silence, people could sense God's handiwork once more. During the weeks that followed, she devoted herself to prayer, counseling, and introspection. And she paid a visit to acquaintances she had lost touch with, apologizing for her distance. She started guiding younger women in ministry and cautioning them not to make the same errors she had. As she released more and more, she felt a heaviness that was neither the violent death she had anticipated nor the violent release of her burdens. Still, she remembered the verse that had been her anchor through thick and thin, "Be still and know that I am God." As she sat by the studio window one morning, she watched the sunrise paint the sky in gold and pink. Turns out those words weren't meant to be a challenge this time. They were meant to be words of peace. I finally understood that giving up didn't imply losing, but rather trusting. I also finally understood that the ministry, my reputation, even in that peaceful moment, with sunlight streaming through the window, she finally let out a breath. The turmoil within her had subsided. She had spent years attempting to lead with courage, but suddenly she realized that the power rested in releasing her grip. The crown she had formerly held so tightly no longer required illumination. It was sufficient to release it and let grace, rather than control, to direct the remainder of her narrative.